Good day to you. This sermon recap is for the Sunday proper 13B in the year of Mark, and preached August 5th in Eau Claire, Wisconsin University Lutheran Church. The text for the 13th Sunday, the proper 13, is a piece from Exodus where we get the story about the manna in the wilderness. We get a text from Ephesians 4, the very beginning of Ephesians 4, 1 to 16, and also then again we continue where we've talked these last weeks. We continue in the book of John, the 6th chapter, where for the first time Jesus speaks one of his I ams. That throughout the book of John, Jesus uses these I am sayings, and this is the first one that the gospel ends with. I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. And so the people say, Sir, give us this bread always. But the catchphrase yesterday for the sermon was turning point. And so a definition of turning point, a moment when the course of events is changed, a point of which there is a change of direction or motion or direction, a critical moment, a decisive time, or significant change. And so that turning point might be a positive thing in life, a moment that you look back and you see and think that your life changed in a positive way, that your life spirals up and forward. Certainly a turning point can be a negative thing, an awful event. That when you think back and you relive that moment 1,000 times, you wish it to be a different thing, and yet it turns out in the same difficult way. I think of that last night. There was a memorial service here in New Richmond, Wisconsin, for the two young boys killed in a car accident. And even when I got home from church yesterday, there was the killing outside of Milwaukee at the Sikh temple. And so that a turning point can also be this terrible moment in life that we never quite get over or never get past, that things can never be the same. And so turning point. A man named Guiteau, Charles Guiteau, tries to assassinate James A. Garfield in 1881, and yet the turning point of that event happened some months earlier. I've been listening to a book on CD on my way back and forth from Eau Claire to New Richmond. That he lay in his bed one night, Charles Guiteau did, and in the midst of all the things that was his life and his desperate want and desire to be famous and to be respected and to be in the government or to be a preacher or to be a lawyer, that he laid in bed one night and thought he heard the voice of God say that he should assassinate the president. And yet of that turning point, lots of turning points, obviously in the life of the Garfield family, but also of Alexander Graham Bell and a scientist named Lister, and one of the very first African American doctors after the Civil War, and one of the very first female doctors. That all these lives had a turning point in Charles Guiteau's misguided desire to assassinate a president. And so when President Garfield died some 80 days later, that the world was never the same, even the Republic, even our country, turning point that we were never the same. Last Wednesday night, one of our members, in the sharing of her life and faith, and framed up her talk in talking about 3 turning points of her life. And so certainly in the Gospel of John, there is this turning point in John 6, that all the things that have been building in John, the changing of water into wine and the cleansing of the temple, that there is a turning point in John, that you have the first, I am the bread of life. I am the bread from heaven. And yet I wanted to take a break from where we've been in these last weeks, the series on the breaking of the bread, and so I did something a bit different. I went to something that's called the semi-continuous lectionary. And there's a bit of irony that when I lift up a piece out of the semi-continuous lectionary, that it is assumed that by the definition that we've been reading this lectionary continuously, to have the piece from the Old Testament from the Jewish scriptures, that we would have been tracking right along. But I lifted out the story from 2 Samuel 12, David's adultery with Bathsheba and the killing of Uriah in that semi-continuous lectionary. For this Sunday, you have Nathan coming to David to convince him of his sin. A turning point. a turning point in the whole kind of rhythm, the whole kind of larger story of who David was, because up to this point, up until 2 Samuel 11, everything that we know of David has been positive. Kind, gentle, compassionate, saving of Jonathan, the mourning for Jonathan and Saul, the killing of Goliath, this hero, everything, every last breath that we know of David up to 2 Samuel 11 has been positive. And yet, one of the gifts that scriptures give us is that we always get to see the characters and the totality of who they are. And so there is this kind of sudden turn in 2 Samuel 11 that David, as king now, coronated as king and sitting on the throne, should be off doing kingly things, but instead commits adultery with Bathsheba. And even in this section of the text, Bathsheba is only called by name twice. The rest of the time she is called the wife of Uriah, to remind the listener, to remind the reader that she is not David's wife, that she was the wife of another. And that 12 times in this little section of 2 Samuel, David is obsessed now because of this thing that he's done. He sends people 12 times. He sends his general, he sends Uriah, he sends Bathsheba, he sends Joab 12 times. He's sending people by his authority. He's sending people around, covering up this thing that he's done, and finally sends Uriah to his death. And so then there is this wonderful turn in chapter 12 that God, in a single sending, God sends Nathan to come to David. And there is this turning point. The obvious turning point is this sin of David, this character turn of David. And that's the easy one to see when all of the 2 Samuel, all of the build up to this, all of the run up to David's story has been positive. That the most obvious turning point is David's faltering. But that's not the turning point that I was after. Nathan comes to David and tells him this story, this wonderfully simple, complex story of a rich man and a poor man, and that they each, the rich man has lots of sheep, lots of flocks, lots of lambs, and yet this poor man has one tiny little ewe lamb that he raises with his family. It's like a daughter. And the key there in Hebrew, that the word is bath, like Bathsheba, that this little one is treasured by this poor man. And yet the rich man has a guest come, and he doesn't want to take one of his own sheep to be as a good host to this guest, to this traveler, and so he takes the poor man's one sheep and slaughters that one for his guest. But the turning point, once David says this man should die, and this man should repay 4 times over, Nathan says, you are the man because you have taken this one who did not belong to you when you had all these other things and all these other persons and all this other riches, that you took the one thing from the one man, that's all he had. And David repents, and David turns. I think that's the literal turning point for David. That now he has to trust God with all of himself, not just his victories, not just his successes, not just his good parts of his character and his virtues, but he has to entrust God with all of himself in the whole of who he is. Last week on Facebook, and knowing that I was going with this kind of theme of turning points, I asked people for the turning points of their lives and got wonderful responses about spouses and partners and children and grandchildren and the turning points of lives that they're so thankful for. One person who gave me permission to preach on this talked about, in the midst of divorce, needing to learn to trust the people in her life that she worked so hard and so tirelessly and so endlessly to try to protect and care for, that in the divorce that she had to entrust them to God. In the midst of counseling, to literally, in role-playing, take these 2 people that she, in the breakdown of their family, that she was so wounded in worrying about, that she literally physically took these 2 people in role-playing and handed them to God and said that they are yours. that we're really good in trusting to God the things that we can fix, and that we're really good in trusting to God the things that we can manage, and the things that we can see, and the things that we can believe, and the things that we can hope. The far more difficult thing, I think, is to entrust God with the frailties of who we are, and the things that we can't fix, and the things that we can't manage, and the things that we can't finally wrap up ourselves, that we have to hand those things over to God. And I think that's the turning point of 2 Samuel, that Nathan comes and tells the story, and David says that man should die. And Nathan says, you are the man, and David simply repents. David simply is broken, and so you get Psalm 51, and you get lots of things that come from this story. But in the turning of that David realizes that his life will never be the same, and that he has to entrust to God his whole self. One last little kind of summary, or one last kind of conclusion piece, a kind of a fun play on words, that as Nathan tells the story, one little word here, one little verse. Now there came a traveler to the rich man, and he was loath to take one of his own flock or herd to prepare for the wayfarer who had come to him, but he took one of the poor man's lamb and prepared that for the guest who had come. And the very end says, David says, as the Lord lives, the man has done this, deserves to die. He shall restore the lamb fourfold, because he did this thing, and because he had no pity. There is a play on words that the rich man was loath. The Hebrew is the same word as David uses at the end, that the rich man had pity on his own flock, and so he took the poor man's sheep, and David said this man shall die because he had no pity. I'd like to think that in the midst of some of our turning points, at least, I would like to think that the play on words there in Nathan's story is that David becomes more compassionate, that David has more pity on the people around him the rest of his life because of his confession and his forgiveness, and that God has compassion on him and forgives. In the CD series, the estranged wife of Guiteau attempts twice to see now the widow of Garfield, and the widow of Garfield twice rejects seeing her. And I don't blame her, I guess. A turning point like that, that's so tragic. And yet, again, in the midst of the death of the two boys in this town that I live, in the midst of the events like someone who walks into a Sikh temple and shoots and kills 7 people, that maybe life and maybe God and maybe faith in the end teaches us a bit of pity for one another and a bit of compassion. And so in the midst of all the turning points of our lives, maybe that's the kindest, maybe that's the greatest, that we simply become more kind to one another. In our own confessions, in our own brokenness, in our own turning points, in our own successes, in our own frailties, in our own joys, in our own sorrows, in our own laughter, in our own tears, that somehow we become a bit kinder to one another. Grace and peace to you in all things. Be well.